The ancient land of Israel is a testimony, an evidence, if you will, of the greatness of what God did in that country. A testimony to the truth of the words that we find in the pages of the Bible.
Thank you. Shukran, shukran. Wow. And that's homemade pita, people. That's not bakery pita. What they're looking like could be Sarah or Rebecca or Rachel. The costume has not changed much. The dark skin would be very close to what she looked like. You remember when God comes to visit Abraham and Abraham right away invites him to eat? Okay, you're experiencing the same hospitality. Oh, the tea.
The children of Israel, or even the Jewish people of today, in many ways think of themselves as a desert people. A great deal of the imagery of the Bible comes out of their experience in the desert. The father of the Jewish people, Abraham, was a desert person, a Negev person. Moses, their lawgiver, lived and worked and led them in the desert. David, their king, was a shepherd and wandered in the desert before he became king. So it's appropriate, if we're to understand the imagery of the Bible, that we experience that part of the country which the Bible calls the wilderness.
We're sitting this morning on a hill in the area of Israel called the Negev. People that live in this area are called Bedouin. We're here this morning to talk a bit about Bedouin, and you see a flock of sheep here. The word Negev means south or dry. If you look around, you see several settlements in the distance at the base of all these hills. Those settlements, those camps are Bedouin. The Bedouin live a very similar lifestyle to what the early people in the Bible did. People like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And so we come here this morning to talk a little bit about the lifestyle of the people called the Bedouin. Maybe in the Bible we could refer to them more as Amalekites or Midianites. So much of the imagery of the Bible comes out of this country. The Israelite people thought of themselves as wilderness people, desert people. They thought of God as being the shepherd. They thought of themselves as being his sheep. They thought of Abraham, their founder, as being a shepherd, a man of the wilderness. Moses, the great lawgiver, was a man who lived in the wilderness, the desert south of here. David, the king, the one who founded their political state, was a shepherd. So a lot of the Bible's imagery comes out of this particular lifestyle. Now, I'd like to just share with you several things this morning, kind of reflecting on the Bible's image of shepherd from Psalm 23 and Jesus' words in the book of John and in other places that may help to really see the impact of what the shepherd and the shepherd lifestyle meant for these people. The first thing I'd like to have you just notice this morning is this flock of sheep over here. The shepherds are children. The two boys here that are walking ahead of the sheep are 11 and 13. And the two girls in the back are actually quite a bit younger than that. Now, to be sure, there's an adult male somewhere in the vicinity to kind of keep an eye on all this. But the shepherding work actually done mostly by children. Certainly, you can't say that adults never care for the sheep. That you even see today. But if you notice that observing these children who are carrying the sheep is the father, the sheep, the head of the group. He's up on the hill over here. And there's a biblical image of that too, because the Bible does talk about Jesus being the chief shepherd. And in a sense, those who are called to be leaders are what we call under-shepherds. And some of you are leaders in big ways and little ways, and so you imitate what Jesus does as you lead others. But I have a question.
Ray, this place just, makes me feel so much at home and reminds me of my boyhood, and, because I did just what these kids are doing here, as a youngster, taking care of my grandparents' flock of sheep. One thing I've come to learn about sheep and goats is that if you leave a flock of sheep just like those, if you kind of go away from them for a while and you're watching them at a distance, the goats will always be the ones to wander. They'll always stray off, and then the sheep will follow those goats. They'll break the flock apart. And that's why at least in our country, there's always less amount of goats than there are sheep, so that doesn't happen too much.
Neat observation, and that brings up, of course, Jesus' parable about how the sheep and the goats are mixed, and then at the judgment day, the shepherd comes and he divides them and puts the goats one way and the sheep the other. And what Elmer just said is really neat, to think that even in our own experience, some of us have been goats, sometimes some of us act like goats and divide the flock.
I like the idea of the under-shepherds. I think of us with children. I think of myself being an under-shepherd, and the sheep are my own children. And I think we need to constantly look for God, for the direction that we will guide them. And then I like the idea that they look to your feet. You know, they recognize our voice, but they look at our feet for our example of what we do.
That's a wonderful image. I love that. I think that's great to think of the opportunities you have to be an under-shepherd and how important it is for you to be like the shepherd. And that children watch your feet, your walk, your daily walk.
Ray, you've changed some of our images of what's said in Psalm 23. Can you comment on "My cup runneth over"?
Since you're talking about the sheep image, and the sheep go to drink or to eat out of a trough when they're in a sheepfold, in a sense, by saying "my cup runs over," you could translate that as "my trough runs over." So you get this image of this large container that is so full that it actually runs over. The sheep listens to his voice, that is the shepherd. He calls his own by name and leads them. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. And then he says, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life for my sheep." So the image is, just like you're seeing out here in many ways, of the shepherd, God to us, Jesus to us, out in front, sheep following, the voice calling, and God saying, "This is the way." Now, I thought about that yesterday as we walked that beautiful Jericho road up toward Jerusalem. You know, in a sense, Jesus is walking the road, but he's out in front of his disciples, and he's saying, "Follow me." I don't know how often he looked back to see if they were or not, but at that point the option was theirs. So we're talking about God giving us the responsibility of affecting and shaping our culture, and what you need to see Jesus doing is Jesus is out there walking ahead and saying, "Here's the battle plan." You have to go out there and very simply give yourself to other people in love and meekness and humbleness and all of those things that we've talked about. And he says, "Follow me. Follow me." And there he goes. I had a Jewish rabbi say to me one time that God walks ahead of us and we have to look at his feet. And he said, you know, when the Israelites were in the desert, they thought of the pillar of smoke and the pillar of fire as God's feet. And the Hebrew says, "And the pillar of fire walked ahead of them." And so they really did think of those as God's feet. And then there's the reference in Revelation where the Son of Man comes on the clouds of glory, and lo and behold, his feet, his legs, looked like a pillar of smoke and a pillar of fire. So even in the New Testament, there's that image that God's feet are out there ahead of us, and as we're down eating the grass, we just kind of keep our eyes up enough to see his feet. You feel the very cool breeze coming from the west this morning off the Mediterranean, and that cool breeze carries moisture. And as that moisture goes down into the ground, you begin to get grass growing. In the Psalm, when the Bible says, "The Lord leads me into green pastures," what you see in front of you are the green pastures of the shepherd. And that's not an exaggeration. I had always pictured the green pastures as belly-deep alfalfa. So when God takes me as his sheep, he plunks me down and I've got everything I need for the rest of my life. But if you think about it, that's not what life is like. The shepherd finds enough grass so that they can fill their mouth right now. The reason those sheep aren't worried about this afternoon is because they know their shepherd always knows where the grass is for this afternoon. And so if I pick up this image, what God says to me is, I'll give you what you need right now. Worry is to deal with tomorrow's problems without tomorrow's green pastures. But you're not going to get tomorrow's green pastures till tomorrow. Now that was a life-transforming concept for me as I began to discover that in this culture, because for me, I was a person who spent a lot of time worrying about tomorrow. Still am, but maybe less so now, because I realized God says, I'll give you what you need right now. We're all doing fine. We got enough to eat. We're healthy. Things are fine. I don't know what's going to happen an hour from now. But God says, don't worry. When it gets here, I'm your shepherd, and I know where the pastures are. Just over a week ago, my mother was killed, and my first instant reaction was, there's no way I can complete this assignment that God has given. And it just came back to me that Psalm 23 was the answer. I needed to deal with each moment and to say, God, I can't think about going to Israel in a week. It's too big. It's something I can't handle. So give me the green pastures for right now. And He did. Jesus tells a parable about the 99 sheep. And one of them wanders away. And there are two dangers when the one wanders away from the other 99. One is if you lose track of the shepherd, you could die for lack of something to eat. And those huge cliffs, wandering away from the shepherd is an extremely dangerous option. You could very easily fall, very easily be seriously hurt. The Bible also says God leads me to quiet water. Now in this particular country, and you can see some of them over there, they have a phenomenon called wadis. And it rains up in those mountains. The farther you go, the more it rains. You can get heavy rainstorms in those mountains, and suddenly the mountains can't absorb enough water, and that water will come rushing down these canyons. Some goes to the east, to the Dead Sea, some to the south, down into this valley and out into the Negev. Well, the sheep have a tendency to go down in those wadis looking for water, because often there are pools of water trapped in the wadi. But that's dangerous, because while you're getting a drink of that water, it could end up killing you. Quiet water is water that is peaceful, not dangerous, not something that's going to hurt you, not something that's going to create a problem for you. So God says, follow me, and I'll show you the quiet water. I'll show you what's safe. I'll show you what's good. There's a tendency sometimes, I think, to satisfy that thirst for life in ways that are potentially very dangerous. And God says, be thirsty, that's wonderful, but let me show you what's good water. We climbed down into the wadi, and we found the acacia trees, just as the Bible describes. We're just about down to the Dead Sea. We're in the bottom of a wadi, so you have to imagine during a rainstorm or a flood, this thing would be full of water, maybe 4 or 5 feet deep. Happened a couple times a year. Normally, in this area, shrubs and trees grow very short. You can look on these hills and see almost nothing growing. But if you get a place where occasionally there's some water like this, all of a sudden this tree will grow. And that's the image in the Psalms of a tree planted by streams of water. And the thought is you can't see the water, but you know there's water because of the size of the tree. So in the life of a person, the idea is someone may not see you rooted in the water of God, but they can tell by who you are and how you live that your roots are in the water. And the proof is not that you can see the water, the proof is what you're like.
The palace fortress that Herod built here was the third largest in the entire world at the time, and certainly one of the most glorious. It's divided into an upper and a lower palace, covering more than 45 acres of territory. The upper palace can be seen for miles. Around the outside, double walls about 15 feet apart, and between those two walls, the chambers and rooms that were necessary for all of his servants and palace staff. On each of the four sides of that upper fortress, a tower several stories high. In these towers were the rooms for the royal family and the government officials. And on the east, the greatest tower of all, more than 100 feet high, where Herod and his own family could live and catch the breezes from the Mediterranean on hot summer days. When one walks through the glory of this palace complex, we're struck by the great vision and the great power that was Herod. And it becomes more obvious what an act of faith it was for the Jewish people to be willing to commit to the fact that Jesus was Messiah and King.
The place is called the Herodian, built by King Herod. If you look here to the east, you can see in the distance the water of the Dead Sea. And just beyond the water, the mountains across the Dead Sea, the mountains of Moab. And then coming from the Dead Sea in this direction, you see the hills of the Judea wilderness. Notice how clearly the wilderness begins and the farmland ends. To the west of us, the Judea mountains. You can see that block of mountains not so very far away from here, almost straight across from us, the Valley of Elah. Just a little bit to our north, kind of sprawling down the hillside over here, you see the town of Bethlehem. Today a pretty large city, pretty modern city in a way. We sit then at the edge of Bethlehem, which is a frontier town. Very clear distinction between the wilderness out here, the land of the shepherd. We've seen the green pastures. David wrote about the green pastures, and if you want to see the green pastures he's talking about, you need to look to the east, because that's where the shepherd went. The shepherd wouldn't come here on the farmland, because as you can tell, there's not a lot of good farmland, so the shepherd stays out there, and the farmer goes over here. The structure we're actually sitting on takes us to the New Testament time. Herod was living and ruling in Jerusalem, but his fear, of course, was Cleopatra to the south and west. And so he had a line of escape routes that allowed him to leave Jerusalem, to come down to this area only in about 8 or 10 miles or so and to find safety. And then just beyond us, Masada, and very soon he'd be back home to where he came from, which is the country of Idumea. One of the largest palaces in the world. The whole complex itself may have been several hundred acres of area. Down below, a huge swimming pool, colonnade around it, a beautiful garden with all kinds of exotic plants. Then up on the top of this hill stands the fortress called the Herodian. You can see across the diameter of this huge open area here, and several stories still left of that glorious palace that was open to the sky. We're sitting on the defensive tower, and again you see the diameter. That tower probably went 60, 70 feet in the air. It kind of stood here as a lookout. You could see it for miles and miles and miles. So you need to feel the dominance of Herod in this particular place. Josephus does tell us that Herod was buried here. He died in Jericho, and the funeral procession Josephus describes comes up from Jericho through that wilderness and then comes down in a glorious funeral procession, and somewhere, without Josephus telling us where, Herod was buried. And as far as scholars know, his body was never found. The reason we really come here for our faith lesson is because of its proximity to Bethlehem. I want you to have a sense of where Bethlehem was and what the land around Bethlehem is like. I like to think that Bethlehem probably looked very much like that little village on top of the hill over there. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to ask the Lord. The Lord said, "2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older brother will become the younger brother's servant." So Esau is born, and he's the older. And Jacob is born, and he's the younger. out of Jacob comes the Jews. And out of Esau comes the people of Edom, lived down across the Dead Sea, but to the south a ways, in the mountains of Edom. But the prophecy was that the older Esau and his family will serve the younger Jacob. In fact, that's even reiterated, if I could read it, in the book of Numbers, where that prophet, just across the sea from us here, the prophet Balaam said, "A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter out of Israel," Jacob's other name, "and he will crush Edom. Edom will be conquered, but Israel will grow strong. Jacob will be strong." So the Jewish people had in their minds that ultimately someday that line of Jacob was going to be in power. But we're sitting in a strange place here, because you see, Herod was from Idumea. Herod was an Edomite. Herod was a descendant of Esau. And all the glory and all the power and everything magnificent in the whole world belonged to Herod. And in that town over there, a baby is born, and you're asked to believe that that baby is the descendant of Jacob, who is Lord and King of everything. I want you to look at where you are, because this whole countryside and every town and village and every place in it is dominated by what stands right here. Look what Herod left. Glorious. I mean, unbelievable stuff. He was an awesome builder and king. But it's all in ruins. And for most of you, if not all of you, the only thing you ever knew about Herod was that he killed little babies at Christmas time. Because Herod was just in it for himself. And worse than that, he was as much of a descendant of Edom spiritually as he was physically. Jesus, as far as I know, he didn't leave one single building. Not one stone you can point on that he ever touched, for sure. Not even a mark on the place he was born. Probably don't even know the place where he died and rose again, at least not for sure. But look what he left behind. The world has never been the same. We come as 33 people of varying degrees of influence. But I don't think anyone would look at us and say that we're the power brokers in our world. There are no presidents here. There are no Supreme Court justices. There are no famous movie actors. There are no great musicians or professional athletes, at least not yet. But you know what? When we look at our world, the power, particularly the power of evil, seems to be so big and so strong and so awesome that what could we 33 people do? But you know what you're asked to believe? That no matter what it looks like out there, no matter how big Hollywood looks, no matter how powerful Wall Street looks, no matter how evil pornography seems, no matter how undefeatable hunger and racism and AIDS appear to be, Jesus Christ is King. It's not Herod, it's not the devil, it's not evil, it's God. Now, there weren't many people that could come and look at that baby and say, I believe it. Now, the question that I have for you and that I have to answer for myself is, do you dare to live as if God is stronger than the evil we face in our own lives and in our own culture? Do you dare to live as if the power we have with us is greater than any power in anything you face in your life that's against you? And I maintain we haven't lived that way. I maintain we've lived as if Herod, or the modern Herod, meaning the evil power of today, is really the stronger. And so we've gone to our convents and our monasteries and we've said evil is too big, too strong. God is not big enough, strong enough to do what we want him to do. People, this palace, this fort right here says no matter what it looks like, no matter how strong it seems, no matter how glorious it is, it's the baby in the manger that's Lord of heaven and earth. And so Matthew the Jew starts his gospel story about Jesus with these incredible words. In the days of Herod the king, Jesus was born.